So let's begin. I want to just set the tone, really just set the tone a little bit about this time period, about where we are and about where we are in history. Next slide, please. So we're looking at really the turn of the century. We're looking at this early, first 20 to 30 years of the 20th century. And, to go back, African Americans have been free almost 40 years. They're coming off the heels of, they're coming into some really strongly formed Jim Crow legislation, Jim Crow laws that are basically governing every aspect of their lives. But they're coming off of their sharecropping in the deep South. They're living in debt peonage where they're working off the land. They're having to call their former enslavers master. The labor contracts that are set up are very, very unfair, and it's keeping them in a space of complete poverty for those that stayed and remained. A number of people, as you know, migrated as part of the Great Migration and went to all kinds of places like Memphis and Detroit and New York and Philadelphia and even to California, and some went to the Northwest as well. So we have this major migration that was happening as well. And African Americans are settling in large urban spaces, and they're trying to figure out their lives. And they also want to claim their sense of citizenship. This is something that they have been trying to do since freedom. From 1865 to 1900, there were a number of African American men that were enfranchised, that took political roles in their state legislatures. They were able to work in small county political positions. So for the first time since they had been in this country, or even born into this country, they were a part of the political process in the little spaces that they could occupy. That almost gets completely wiped away at the turn of the century by the time the 20th century arrives. And at this point, there's now a strong effort of pushing back African Americans, particularly those that are successful. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that they did this, and you may have seen this image before, but was through racial science, the racial science movement, which actually started in the 19th century and then really took off and became part of the eugenics movement in the early 20th century. And scholars debate about when that starts, when one starts and the other ends, but they're very much along the same lines where they were measuring skulls to understand brain size. They were trying to say African Americans were not as smart because of the size of their skull. They were more like apes, the shape of the jaw. So they did all this racial science to try to show that the white race was more superior. And this is why you see the different structures of the skull. This is happening at a time where there's the world fairs where they have African Americans sort of paraded around as monkeys and all kinds of derogatory terms. This is also against the backdrop of large scale lynchings. You see the other statistics that we have here on this chart, and this is just one. This is just African American men. We know that Mexican Americans were lynched. We know that women were lynched, and we know that other groups of people experienced lynchings. But the numbers of those that were lynched were predominantly African American men and women. And we see here from the turn as we're nearing the 20th century, you're starting to see those numbers increase as you see that on this chart. The numbers of African Americans. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. So racial science and racial violence combined were two strategies that were used to keep African Americans down, particularly those that have been successful. All right, next slide, please. But Black people did not just sit by and not fight back. And I think that's really important to understand. And oftentimes, when we're taught, or at least when I was taught about lynching and so forth, when I was growing up, I didn't always learn about the efforts that African Americans did to fight against this. And so, we're coming off of also the heels of World War One, and African Americans were present. I always say this: African Americans were present in every war in American history, and uniformed Black men wanted to show their desire to be a part of this country. And they felt like when they came back from the war, they weren't treated the same. They weren't treated the same when they had all these war parades. They were relegated to the back sections. They didn't get the same respect that other military officers and military enlistees received. And they were very, very disappointed about that. So this particular image is from the 1917 silent parade that was in New York City, where it was organized by the NAACP, and there were over 10,000 African Americans who marched in this parade to fight against lynching, the lynchings that were happening all over the United States, not just the South, but that were happening against African Americans. And so this is just one example of African American agency in the face of great victimization. Okay. Next slide, please. Ida B. Wells, one of my favorite figures of this time period. If you all want to do a little homework, the New York Times did a project on obituaries that they had not given to people in the past, where they should have been written up when they passed away years and years ago. And I forgot the title of the project, but Ida B. Wells has just been given an obituary in the New York Times. So if you want to know a little bit more about who she was, but she was a crusader for social justice, and she logged and recorded all of the lynchings that she was able to come across for African Americans. So it's called a Red Record. This is a copy of the book that she published. So not only are African Americans marching, they're also publishing, they're also cataloging, they're also protesting against the injustices that they were experiencing at that time. And if it wasn't for this level of protest, it's hard to say how many changes would have happened. Okay. Next slide, please. This moves us into the time period of the Tulsa Massacre. And this is something that you will be hearing about a lot over the next, I would say, 8 or 9 months, because we're coming up on the 100th year anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre. You will find when you do research on it that some people refer to it as a Tulsa riot, but it really was a massacre. Where this was a successful district called the Greenwood District in downtown Tulsa, where African Americans had their own businesses. They had law offices, they had churches, they had funeral businesses, and they had a hospital. They had all kinds of community services for their community, and it was a very successful, one of the most wealthy blocks of property for African Americans in the United States at that time. And as I mentioned earlier about lynchings are often or mob violence often comes on a rumor or a gesture of where somebody felt like they were disrespected. And I could go on and on. I have this slide that I use in class where I show all the different reasons why African Americans were lynched. Some of it was just looking at somebody in the eye, or not stepping off the sidewalk, or not holding a door for somebody, or not tipping your hat, or not taking your hat off. All kinds of little, really, really petty. And I like to list all these to my students, because they start reading them out loud and they see like it didn't matter. Like they could find any reason to lynch because there was sort of this mob rule. Well, there was an incident on an elevator, and there was an accusal of an African American not being respectful to a white woman. But this is all speculative, and it's different people depending on which documents you look at tell this story differently. Um, because of that, there was a huge riot and uprising where hundreds of African Americans were murdered. They were riled up, they were pulled, and some of them were taken out of town, but they were also marched to a convention center where they were kept and housed, very similar to the ways in which African Americans were kept during slavery. A number of them were murdered and killed, and the whole Black Wall Street, which was the name of the Greenwood District, was burned down. Not just that, but also people's homes. There was over, I think, something like 1,200 buildings, houses, and businesses were torn down and burned down to the ground in that moment. Excuse me. And so that is what happened in Tulsa. Next slide, please. We're going to look at a video. Thank you. So you see that the way, I mean, what I like about that clip is that you have an opportunity to actually see some of the footage of not only what the businesses look like prior to the massacre, but also you have an opportunity to see it afterwards. And there are some really powerful aerial shots that you can see the devastation and demolition that happened. But the lives that were lost is really what's incredible. And that's really how you saw that the last image in the video said running the Negroes out of town, out of Tulsa. So that was literally what they were trying to do. This year, you will see a number of celebrations and stories about Tulsa. I just received a message about a week ago from a teacher saying that they were from Oklahoma and that they grew up in Oklahoma, not far from Tulsa, and never heard about the massacre until this year. And I think that is pretty amazing. That tells us a lot about what kinds of choices that publishers put in their books that they're for the children that you guys are teaching and the students that you're teaching. So speaking of which, in doing research for this, I want to go to the next slide, please, because these kinds of events also happen in our own backyards. Most of you, as all of you, are teachers here in Texas, and some of you may have heard of the Houston race riot of 1917. Just to give you some background, this is also stemming from slavery. When you have in the post-slavery era, they were trying to put together African American troops to be part of the Buffalo Soldiers, as you know. These individuals, there was a troop of 654 African Americans who had gone over. They actually worked in the Spanish American War. They were brought in to deploy against some of the challenges that they were having in St. Louis when there were race riots in St. Louis. And they came to Houston, and they were told they would be welcome to the city, and they were told that they would be treated fairly and respectfully. They came to help create the 7,600 acre National Guard Training Center. But when they came, they were treated with disrespect from not only ordinary citizens, but also the police, including the chief of police at the time. They call this event the Camp Logan Mutiny. We can have a conversation later about riot, mutiny, or murder, or massacre. I think we should talk about those terms and when and why we use them, because I think that really says something about the perspective, right, that we're taking. This only happened for a couple hours. There was a discrepancy about a Black woman, and one of the soldiers was going to check on her to make sure she was okay. She wasn't fully clothed, so we don't really know what happened at the time. There's lots of different stories that tell you what happened. But when they found out that one of their comrades had been taken in by the police, a number of the soldiers went and tried to get arms. The military tried to lock up the armory and prevent them from getting any weapons, and they took to the streets. 156 soldiers were then involved in this particular uprising, riot, massacre, whatever you want to call it. And we can talk about that. At the time, there was swift justice that was brought in, where some of their families weren't even informed. 118 of them were indicted, 110 found guilty, and quickly 9 were hanged. We do have some evidence from like letters that were written to the family that they got after their relatives were hung. But there were also 63 life sentences. This, I would add, really connects to this whole criminalization of African American citizenship, which brings us into a more modern era. I will stop here and turn it over to my colleagues, but we can talk about some of this. And you're going to be looking at documents related to some of the climate and the context of things that I've talked about. So we'll be able to talk about this some more in a few minutes. Thank you. Next slide, please. I'm turning it to the Dr. Brown.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. I was talking and I was muted. Thank you very much, Dr. Berry. Dr. Anthony Brown and myself will talk a bit about constructs, key constructs in the study of race and racism. For those of you who were on the call last week, some of these constructs will be similar and then some will be different. We think that these particular constructs are helpful in understanding this particular time period and can also be used as you are looking at documents and working with documents with your students. But there are also ideas that you could bring up with them as well to sort of bring this to life and to show the racialized aspects of it. Next slide, please. Okay, the first thing that we want to establish is that there was a presence of racism in the US and in US history. And so this is an important component. There's 2 ways to sort of think about race. We have Jim Crow racism, and during this particular time in our country's history, we were in Jim Crow racism, right? There was legal racism, legal racial segregation, and in many ways, this is sort of what defines a place like Greenwood, right? It was a sort of a group that was self-sufficient for many reasons, because they had to be, right? They didn't have access outside of their community. Um, we now live in what uh, sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva would call a colorblind sort of era of racism. So it's not that racism is gone, it is no longer legal, but it is something that still exists. And it often exists in ways that we don't acknowledge it. And so what colorblind racism, sometimes it's referred to as color evasive racism, is simply recognizing and noticing that race, we have racial differences, we have racial histories, and we have differences in how people get treated because of race. However, sometimes there's a desire to turn the other way, to maybe not acknowledge that racism still is here, or to just assume that we are in a much better place than we were in the past. And so these are two ways to sort of orient ourselves to racism. Next slide, please. Another really important construct is the notion that race is a social construction. It is not, from anthropologists and scientists talk about the fact that this is an idea that has been constructed, and it was constructed through meticulous practices. And we got to see a few of those ways that race was socially constructed, particularly during this time period, right? You have science, as Dr. Berry gave some examples of how science itself was utilized as a way to establish and to rationalize racial difference, and hence the differences in sort of material um, outcomes that were associated with people across different races, which led to laws, and there were racial segregation laws. There also were policies, certain policies that were in place. But then there was popular culture, right? And we had movies, Birth of a Nation, other growing newspapers, ways that magazines, fairs that promoted racial difference and amplified racial difference. We also have our everyday practices that people engaged in that helped them to understand race and to pass along race meanings. And then finally, they're just the stories that we tell, the ideologies that are embedded in our communities, in our national story, that we use to understand race. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are at least three ways to think about racism, three different types of racism. And for our discussion today, structural institutional racism is probably the most important way to sort of think about racism. So we have interpersonal racism, which is simply racism that takes place between individuals and maybe groups, and they're leveraging the belief that there is one race is superior over another. Internalized racism, of course, is racism that we find in our larger society, but that gets internalized often by people who are within the group that is actually targeted by racism. And then finally, there's structural institutional racism. And this is racism that's built into the very institutions and structures, the structures of society, the way that the society is organized, but also the institutions that make up that society. So we might think of an example of this might be if a person who is African American cannot attend a school with white children, right? This is a sort of this is a institutional racist process, right? But it's also built into the sort of fabric of our larger society. Laws that are passed that don't allow Black and white people to perhaps eat together in the same restaurant, or they can't marry one another. Those would be, we can think of those as both institutional and structural. And it's important that we think about and recognize this form of racism, because sometimes it's harder for students to understand. It may seem a little bit more abstract, and often when even when they do talk about racism, they generally are thinking about interpersonal racism. So helping them to distinguish between the two is really important. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Anthony Brown.
So go ahead and move to the next slide. So if we think about the idea of race being a social construct, I want you to kind of think in your mind of, of a building. It's actually something that is made. And if something is made, something made it. So if you think about a social construction as something that is kind of monumental, it's held in place. It can only be held in place by the sets of conditions that allow it to be held in place. And those are sometimes seen as legitimate means of defining. Like it'd be different if someone just sat on a soapbox or put in a social media a few comments here and there, or just random. But it's important to note that something can only be socially constructed by those sanctioned institutions. Last week, we looked at documents by Thomas Jefferson. So the ideas that are presented and put forth by a president, sometimes they're put forth by historians and theologians. Sometimes they're put in the context of popular culture, so they're seen in a place where people see in high esteem. And so through the 20th century, it's through television. But a feature of it being a social construction, there's two central features of what makes something a social construction. A, the legitimacy of the person or persons or institutions that are constructing the idea of race. And the second feature is reproduction. But another part that is key, and they work hand in hand, if you recall the image that Dr. Berry offered, where you see the image of the different tiers of man, where a European Greek statues at the highest top of the racial hierarchy, orangutan at the bottom, and then men of African descent are somewhere located in between these images. So if we think about these ideas, the social construction would be on the left-hand side, and then the lynching would be the material consequences. But in some ways, this image may not necessarily, they work hand in hand. They can't exist without it. Once you invent or create someone into something, into a monster, you can do anything to them. If you see them in a particular way and you ground their identities in a particular way, their material consequences being the right to live, the right to own property, the right to even exist, to marry, to all the things that define our material lives, those real tangible aspects of our lives, can only be made possible by the ideas that carry with them. I think there's one way to think about Tulsa would be to see it as random acts of violence. But here we want you to understand that Tulsa could not happen without racial science. Tulsa could not happen without the kind of theology of race that existed in the early 1900s. I think taking a quote from the historian George Fredrickson really summarizes it well. He says, quote, "It would probably be misleading, however, to describe the purveyors of a brute image of the Negro as simply a group of cynical propagandists, consciously exaggerating black crime and sexuality as a way of increasing the pressures for a more thoroughgoing system of black subjugation and exploitation. Many were probably expressing their own genuine fears and hatreds, feelings so intense that they suggested dissatisfaction with any conceivable relationship with the Negro. What white extremists may have confronted in the image of the black brute was not so much a Negro as a projection of unacknowledged guilt feelings derived from their own brutality towards blacks. In order to deserve the kind of treatment he was receiving in the United States in 1900, the black man presumably had to be as vicious as the racists claimed. Otherwise, many whites would have had to accept an intolerable burden of guilt, perpetuating or tolerating the most horrendous cruelties and injustices. But in seeing blacks as bad enough to deserve what they got, racists undoubtedly conjured up a monster that was capable of frightening its creators and driving them to new frenzies of hatred. So we want you to think about both. If you think about a social construction, it's like how the group is represented, the institutions that anchor those representations in place, and the material consequences are the outcomes of housing and even life that are attached to them. Let's go to the next slide. However, one of the key aspects that Dr. Barry, Dr. Brown, and I, it's kind of a cornerstone of our work is that in the midst of the most complicated, the most difficult aspects that African Americans faced, even lynching, you'll see aspects of resistance. Resistance manifesting in several different ways, as Dr. Barry laid out. Sometimes resistance is defined actually literally taking arms to fight, and there's even instances in the history of Tulsa where African Americans are taking arms and fighting against those aggressors. So there is this kind of physical presence that exists within civil rights movements, placing its body in the midst of danger. And you see the kind of the history of the civil rights movement where African Americans are placing their bodies within harm. Those acts of resistance. But there are other forms of resistance that sometimes don't often get positioned, which is the behind scenes work that African Americans do. Little subtle things like making sandwiches and filling water bottles and providing food, providing clothes, making sure that people are safe when they boycott a bus and walk along the ways. Robin D.G. Kelly calls it the hidden transcripts of resistance. And then resistance that comes through intellectual discourse, of the course, the Red Record being a great example of that, that African Americans wrote extensively against these ideas. While there were ideas about racial science, African American scholars wrote against racial science. While there were ideas about theology, they wrote against the theology that suggested African Americans were outside of the providence of God. So it's important that while we study or understand the kind of domains of race that have subjugated African Americans, it is equally important that we understand the ways in which African Americans resisted in very bold and active ways.